Wow. Dankeschön. Guten Morgen. Ich heiße Peter. Ich wohne in London. Ich bin sehr glücklich, hier zu sein. Ich kann nicht sprechen Deutsch, and that's it. That's all I'm going to say. My job is now, my title is Creative Technologist, but it's kind of mixed with Creative Technologist and Front-End Lead. Basically, it means I get to evaluate cool new technologies, web technologies, and then tell our clients what we can and can't do. We try and come up with creative ways for them to do new stuff. And so I have to keep an eye on what's coming. And one of the things that's coming that most excites me is what I'm here to talk about today, which is web components. Before I get into it properly, just a couple of little points. Point number one, what you see here is subject to change. But when I say that, I mean just the property names and some of the values, things like that, they're subject to change. The concept of web components is not going away. This is not some floated, mooted technology that may or may not happen. This will happen, but possibly not exactly in the format I'm going to show you. The second point is there will be code. There will be lots of code. I've tried to keep it to a minimum, but I can't kind of avoid telling you about new code stuff without showing you too much code. And it's ironic that I've been asked to speak here at CSSconf, because CSS is going to make up about 25% of what I'm going to talk about. I have to get through the HTML and JavaScript stuff to get to the good CSS stuff at the end. So all the explanation of web components is just to get me to where I want to be to talk about CSS. So I've said I'm here to talk about web components, but that's not exactly the truth. What I'm actually here to talk to you about is the secret of ultimate power. Bet you didn't know that when you bought your tickets. I want to give you a very quick demo. This is the only time I'm going to break out the browser window, so if you excuse me for this. So what we've got here is a video element. And a video element, you can see the markup for it. I hope that's large enough for everybody to see. It's just a video element with nothing inside it, completely empty. But that video element has a play button, and it has a seek bar, and it has a timer, and it has a volume control, and it has... So where is all that stuff? It's not here in the markup. So we have to rely on the browser to render that stuff for us. But why should that be the case? Why can't we make our... Well, we can make our own with JavaScript. But why can't we... Why do we have to use JavaScript to build this stuff from scratch? Why can't we make our own stuff? And there's actually a little bit of a secret in here. I've said it's empty, but if I can find my cursor, and I can enable this option here, and now go back into my markup. It's really hard doing this over my shoulder. What's this inside? There's a document fragment. Wait, there's a div, and there's lots more divs, and there's tons of divs, and there's input types. This video element is full of markup, but none of it's exposed to you. The browser vendors are holding back this stuff from you. Back to my slides, if I can. It's gone back to the wrong slide. OK, so this thing is actually full of markup, which makes me think, what the fridge is going on? Incorrect slide. All of this stuff, the video element, the date picker, the progress bar, all of this stuff contains this markup, which is not available to you as developers. The browser makers have created it with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and just not exposed it to you. This is the core of the concept that's known as the shadow DOM. You've probably heard of the shadow DOM. That's essentially what it is. It's secret markup inside elements. It's rendered, but it's invisible in the DOM. It's kind of like when you're on the metro and you're reading a copy of Faust by Goethe, but inside you've actually got a copy of Shades of Grey. Geheimes Verlangen, I don't even want to know what that means. So the shadow DOM is shades of gray. There's your little tweetable thing for today. I want to show you quickly how you can make your own shadow DOM. The first step is to create a shadow root. And one thing, if you just want to bluff your way through talking about the shadow DOM, just put the word shadow in front of a bunch of stuff. You can talk about shadow root, shadow DOM, shadow host, shadow cat, shadow wars, shadow anything. Just start talking about shadow stuff, and people go, oh, he knows shadow DOM. The shadow root is the new root inside the element. And it's very, very easy to create. You select an element, and you say, create a shadow root. That's it. What that's done is that's created that new root inside that element. And then you can put some content inside there and append it to your target element. You've created a shadow DOM inside that element. That's how simple it is. The markup, say you have this markup. So you've got a div with an ID of foo, and inside that is an h1. And then you apply the rule I've just done, which has created a new shadow root with an h2 inside it. The end result kind of looks like this. The h1 is no longer visible. It's been made invisible, and the shadow root takes preference. The shadow DOM is what shows up. Just to break that out a little bit, that's the shadow host, which I mentioned before, which is the element we've selected. And then the old original DOM markup was the h1. That's the real DOM, as I call it. And then we've created a new element inside that with an h2, which is the shadow DOM. Ultimate power. Creating elements inside elements which aren't available to anybody else. You control how the page displays. Ultimate power. You've taken over the browser vendor's role. Shadow DOM is one attempt at solving a problem. And there are other complementary technologies that's aimed at solving the main problem, which use HTML and CSS as well. And the problem is this. Say we've created a nice widget on our website, which does, I don't know, something. Whatever it does doesn't matter. But we've created this widget, and we're going to use it extensively across our whole site. And we've created some CSS, which is going to style it blue. And then we go, well, this widget works so well on this site, I'm going to move it over to one of my other sites. Special effects. The problem is on our other site, we have an existing selector with higher specificity, which uses another color. It's overwritten this thing. And this is what prevents us from having like genuine code reusability today. There are lots of ways we tried to stop this. We've come up with object-oriented CSS, BEM, DIY, all this stuff, which try to work around this problem. But the problem is still there. This is still a risk of code reusability. The solution lies in what's called encapsulation. And if you've used lots of other object-oriented languages, you'll understand encapsulation already. Encapsulation basically means the thing has all it needs. Everything it needs is contained within itself. But it also means nothing gets in and nothing gets out. So this encapsulation would allow us to pick up a bunch of code and put it on another website and not have to worry about inheritance or conflicts, anything like that. This is the problem that web components are solving. We actually do have encapsulation in HTML already. It looks like that. You could, if you wanted to, put all your stuff inside a separate document and include it all with iframes, and you have some encapsulation. The problems with iframe, well, there are too many to list, but I'll try a few. Extra network requests, multiple rendering contexts, and possible cross-origin resource sharing conflicts, which make basically iframes just not a great solution. So the better encapsulation is web components. Shadow DOM is part of web components, but what are the whole thing? One definition would probably be they're a set or a suite of emerging complementary standards aimed at making reusable widgets. I would probably best define them as the biggest change to web development since XML HTTP request. They're genuinely going to be that transformative. So the three core components of the web components, components of web components, parts, I don't know, the 3 bits of web components are shadow DOM, templates, and custom elements. Shadow DOM we've already covered, so I will move on to talk about templates. Hands up if you've used Mustache, Handlebars, some kind of, right, most of you. So you're aware with how we do templating at the moment is probably done something like this, where you include a script and you put stuff in it, and you can include variables and holding and all that kind of stuff. That's a very, very simple way of doing it. So this is a really common pattern to do this now, which is why we have these JavaScript libraries. But what web standards bodies are doing now is trying not to create brand new stuff and give it to you. They're trying to look at the stuff you do and make that native. So this is one of the first patterns that is going to go native. So we've got this new template element. And the template element just does this. You define it, and then it has markup inside it. So what's the advantage of doing that instead of using JavaScript? The markup inside this is inert. When the browser loads the page with the template element inside it, it does nothing with the markup that's inside the template element. So if I had this, I had an external script being called and an image being called. When I use the template element, none of that stuff gets loaded. The markup is completely inert. It does nothing. All it's there for is for you to pick up and use elsewhere. If I go back to my original example I showed a second ago, I've got just an H2 element. It's super simple, barely worth making a template for. So a little bit, this might be a little bit complex for you, but try and stay with me. So what's inside the template element is known as content. Everyone still with me on that? Okay. So what's in here is known as the content. And we can get this content using the new content object, API. So we're going to clone that element in there. We're going to get the content and make a copy of it. And then we can, say, choose another element that's on the page and just append our content inside it. So given markup like this, we could then clone what was in our template, just append it inside like that. Really simple. That's what templating does. You're all used to it. Everybody knows it. The advantage is, at this point, the markup becomes active. So if you had images, if you had external resources, scripts, and everything, when they get inserted into the DOM, then they load. Then they become active. Then you can select them. So templates is just doing exactly what we've already done. They've just standardized it and used the power of the browser to make it a little better. This is what browsers do best, is being able to standardize the stuff that you built on top of them and make them kind of native, give them core functionality that they couldn't do otherwise. But if you've got templates in your page, as I showed there, if they're in your markup, obviously they can only apply to the same page. There's got a kind of a one-to-one relationship, unless you're using AJAX, XML, HTTP requests, whatever. But generally, just like that, they can only be applied to the same page. So what we want to be able to do is make those templates more useful. We want to be able to share them across multiple documents, which is where the import relation type comes in. So just by doing this, you can have the link in your head. You can say it's an import, and you just include an HTML fragment. This will be done natively in the browser, so you'll be able to take all those templates you've already made, and you'll be able to share them across multiple files. From a one-to-one relationship, you suddenly go like that. This is the reusability that we've been talking about. This provides that reusability, or makes it much, much easier. That's what this stuff's intended to do. It's not intended to do something brand new. It's intended to make stuff easier for you and native. So we talked about Shadow DOM, we talked about templates. It's time to come on to custom elements. So you've created stuff with a template. You might have appended a Shadow DOM into it. You've made code that's encapsulated and reusable, but it still relies on you kind of marking up your content with class names or something like that, which just seems a bit of a legacy kind of pattern. Say we created a special kind of new bar called a Wunderbar, we would still have to use our class names and everything to apply those styles. But wouldn't it be better, again, if we could do that natively, if we could go for real 100% reusability? Just like we've seen Shadow DOM gives us access to the elements inside other elements, why can't we have access to the elements themselves? If we're doing a constant, repetitive markup pattern, why shouldn't we be able to make an element that does that for us? And now we can. You just register the element in the DOM. Just say, OK, we'll register this element, and we're going to call it Wunder-bar. It has to be something hyphen something, because all HTML elements are a single word. So this, by hyphenating, it just prevents conflicts with existing and future HTML elements. So we register that, and now we have an element called Wunderbar, which we can just place into our document. It gets rendered at DOM time. When the DOM is rendered, it behaves just like every other element on the page. And inside that Wunderbar, we have our shadow DOM, we have our templates. So what we've got here is fully encapsulated and reusable elements. With Shadow DOM, with templates, with custom elements, we can put stuff inside our elements, and we can just take that element, put it anywhere in our documents, and it will work and behave the same every single place. Basically, what this does, as I've heard quoted before, is it kind of brings semantics back to markup. Rather than your page being covered in divs or whatever, or extended buttons, you can create your own elements, register them, and they will work, and they will provide the exact same functionality everywhere. This is what Web Components does. Encapsulation, reusability. Dead simple. What I've shown you is like the tip of the iceberg. They do loads more. You can have per element APIs. You can define your own. It's exceptionally powerful, but the basic setup to get it up and running, the core concepts are simple. And I think at the moment, the big problem with Web Components is it's probably just lacking a bit of documentation. It's probably lacking a bit of detail. It's hard to get your head around at first, but it's really, really super simple. So now that I've talked about what Web Components are using HTML and JavaScript, I can get to the CSS at last. It is CSSconf, after all. One brand new concept that Web Components bring, and I say brand new, it's brand new to CSS. It's not brand new to the web or computing languages, it's brand new to CSS. It's the concept of scope. Now we're going to have to start thinking about scope in our documents, which if you use JavaScript, you're already perfectly aware of. But just to give you a quick example, if I were to use an inline style element like this, save the booing and the hissing until afterwards. If I were to use an inline style element like this, CSS all has the same scope currently. So no matter where I place that style in my document, it's going to render every single P across my whole document. There's no scope. It doesn't get contained just to where I put it in the document. The scope is totally global. But we want to be able to pick up elements and drop them in other places, and we want to have that encapsulation. We want them to be contained. We want them to be encapsulated. If we're putting CSS inside our documents, inside our widgets, and dropping them into websites, that global scope is going to leak styles back out into the document. It's going to have the opposite problem of what we want. So the first attempt at working around this is very, very simple. You just add the scoped attribute to your style. When that's there, CSS has scope. It's scoped to the parent of wherever you've placed that style. Now that P will only apply here. You don't actually need to do this if you're using Shadow DOM. If I do this, if I'm setting up a new shadow route and I apply some CSS in there, I don't need to scope that. Because Shadow DOM has its own scope, the shadow scope. I told you about the shadow X pattern, right? Everything, shadow something. Shadow scope. And that's provided by something called the shadow boundary. The shadow boundary is not, as I first suspected, the name of the evil empire in Babylon 5. A big laugh for Babylon 5. That was good. That was big here in Germany, right? Shadow boundary basically works like this. So say we have our little reusable widget, and we apply some CSS, and CSS is just applied directly to the widget, right? That's non-controversial. Everybody knows that. When we create a shadow DOM, it puts a shadow boundary around that DOM content, and the CSS is turned away. The way we can change that, we can either say, actually, I want this widget to inherit all of the styles from my page. That's intentional. So we can just, when we set it up, we can just say, apply author styles is true. And that will just let the CSS pass through the shadow boundary by explicit permission. But there are times when we don't want the whole of the CSS, the style sheet, to be applied to our widget. We just maybe want some bits of it. We want to expose the widget to the CSS. We have to create kind of an API for it, a very low-level API kind of thing, so we can just allow little bits of CSS to apply to where we want them. And this is done through pseudo-elements. Now, you've probably used pseudo-elements before. It's very, very likely you have, like before, after, or you can get even more complex ones. Like I showed very briefly earlier an example of a progress bar, a CSS, an HTML5 progress bar. And if you view the shadow DOM for a progress bar, that's the main element. And then inside that, you get a div, which has this pseudo element, WebKit progress bar. And then inside that, there's a WebKit progress value. So if I want to restyle the progress bar, WebKit has exposed certain parts of it to me. So I could change the color of that progress bar from green to blue. I could do whatever I want with it, because they've actually exposed that to me. And there's a lot of these. If you search online, you'll find a whole list of these WebKit-only pseudo-elements and Firefox-only pseudo-elements. And with the shadow DOM, with us being able to create our own reusable widgets, we want to be able to do the same as well. These are being called parts, or the part attribute. And so when you set up your shadow DOM, you've created a shadow root, and then you just add an attribute to whatever content you put inside. You just say the part is, and you give it a name, apes, in my case. And then you put that content inside your target. So when it's rendered, you'll get this, you get your div, and then you get your document fragment, which means inside here is the shadow DOM. And we say, that's how it's rendered. So we say part equals apes, which means that's exposed to the CSS. So by use of this pseudo-element function, we can now apply styles directly to the attributes we wanted to before. So we've created our own kind of little CSS API for this thing. We've exposed certain parts of it to styling. So I'm going to go back to scope for a second. With CSS bringing in scope, that allows us to do something that was previously not really permitted in CSS. They're called custom properties, but really, they're variables. But they're not full variables. They have limits. This is how they're defined. First of all, I give it some scope. I say this one applies to the whole body of the document. And I'm defining a custom element, a custom property called var-highlight. That's the format you have to use always, var-something. And then I give that a value. And then in my code, I use the var function with the name that was after that. So it's very, very simple, variable-like syntax. It's not the full variable syntax. People have asked, oh, why not just use the string? You know, everywhere else uses the string. And that's because these aren't fully variables yet. That's why they're not being called variables, they're being called custom properties, because you can't do anything with, for example, the selector. You can't do anything with the property. You can only change values. So that's why they're not being called variables so much as custom properties. So this scope I talked about. So I've defined previously, I've got my thing set on the body, and I'm going to do it. But then I can also just change it to say, well, only inside the foo element, then change what this custom property does. Again, these are very simple. Just like if you use SAS or less, you can send values or arguments into these. You can create quite complex things, but I'm showing you the absolute basics. So this is the reason why we have these now. And I know I've seen arguments, again, saying, well, we can do variables in SAS. Let's just have that. You can, that's true. The one thing that browser's implementation brings to the party is scope. You can't do this scope when using SAS or less. So the browser, when they looked at it and they said, well, actually, as we're creating scope, now is a good time for us to have custom properties. We couldn't do that before. There was no reason for us to do it. And as everybody was totally correct, you could do it in SAS and less. There was no use for it. But CSS have found this opportunity, which is to provide scope, which is why they're being done natively. Again, you don't have to provide this if you're creating a shadow DOM. Actually, sorry, I beg your pardon. Shadow DOM, this is the one exception where it will inherit the CSS whether you permit it or not. That scope applies to everything in the document. So if you're creating something in the shadow DOM, you can still use your custom properties there. That's perfectly valid. OK, so I've just got a little time left. I'm going to talk about, briefly, the future, or the possible future. This is stuff that's been mooted, floated, may not happen, not 100%, because there are issues around it. But it's so exciting and potentially terrifying in what it allows us to do that I really wanted to talk about it. And these are called decorators. There's a new decorator element proposed. It's not implemented anywhere, it's proposed. So it's a decorator element, and you give it an ID or some kind of unique identifier. And then you put a template inside it, and you can put whatever you like in that template. The other new thing we've got here is this content element. And that's blank in here. It's totally blank, so it says content. Say we've got this markup here, which is from a conference I did previously and neglected to update. Say we've got this markup here, and we want to, what we can now do with it using decorators is using this new property, take the template, which we defined on the previous page, take that template and apply it to this element. And the content of this element, the H1, will now go where the content tag was before. So this markup will become, using CSS, this markup. We're actually applying markup with CSS, which, as I said, is actually really, really clever because you can use media queries to actually fundamentally change the page, but also really terrifying. That could backfire badly, which is why it's not been implemented yet. But it's been floated, and I think it's a clever, clever idea. But there are lots of issues around it, so that may not happen. So you're probably asking, yeah, this is great, when's this stuff coming? The thing is, this stuff is already here, in bits and pieces, and quite often prefed off. Most of it is in Chrome or Canary. These guys are really pushing this stuff hard. It was their idea originally. Especially Chrome Canary already has Shadow DOM, already has scope styles, already has some of custom elements. I think it's got the template element is also in there. So it's all there. And some of it you have to enable through the flags, but it's kind of mostly there. And because of that, Opera, which is based on Blink, is also going to have this stuff. Safari is following along slowly. This stuff was all implemented in WebKit before Chrome switched to Blink. So some of it's still in WebKit, but they're planning to take some bits out. They're not too keen on the Shadow DOM right now, but it is actually still there. If you download Safari 6.1 or 7, it has that flag to hide or enable the Shadow DOM. So it's implemented, but they're removing the API, so you can't do anything with it. And Firefox, or Firefox Nightly, also implements quite a lot of this stuff. They have custom element registration. They have the template element. They have scoped styles. That's all in Firefox. Again, some of it has to be enabled. But this is not something, originally when it was mooted, it was like, oh, Chrome or just, Google are just creating this stuff which no one's going to use. It's not the case. This is a cross-browser, like everybody's behind this. This is the future of web development, whether you like it or not. It definitely is coming. The best place to learn about this stuff, go to the Polymer project. And again, this stuff is unique because the Polymer project is kind of a polyfill for all of this stuff, but it's also how this stuff is getting created. All of the feedback, the browsers are not implementing much of this stuff natively. It's all being done at kind of a low-level API level. So they're building this Polymer library to not only polyfill the stuff, but also to reflect the latest standard and take in developer feedback. So the more you use this, the more developed the standard gets. This is being driven by the community. So it's a really, really interesting opportunity to get involved. Go to html5rocks.com. They've got a bunch of stuff on web components, some really good tutorials. A guy called Eric Biegelman at Google who's driving this stuff, great at explaining all of these things. Follow him on Google+. He writes about a lot there. Mozilla have created this pattern library called Brick, which is a series of custom elements that you can just take and use straight away. As I said, Mozilla are fully behind this. And there's a website called customelements.io, which is a community-based repository of custom elements so you can just take the library, take the element, drop it in your page, and this stuff just works. In conclusion, what's that doing there? In conclusion, web components provide reusability and encapsulation, and scope is coming to CSS. Dankeschön. Thanks.